In this session on addiction, I'll be sharing with you how and why we fall into addictive behaviour patterns. We'll be covering how this behaviour is triggered by our response to stress and also a desire to self-medicate in order to move into a place of feeling better within ourselves. Now, we are all, in one way or another, addicted to something that isn't healthy for us. And one of the most powerful and socially acceptable of all addictions begins from a very early age with the introduction of one of the most addictive and widely available substances on the planet: sugar. In fact, this addiction is often nurtured in us before we have even been weaned, as it is added to baby formula that we use to make baby milk. So, unless you were a breastfed baby, your addiction to the white stuff will have probably started before you could even speak. Sugar is not to be underestimated. If you go into any supermarket in the world, you will find that almost all processed food will contain sugar in one form or another. Why is this? Well, it's because food manufacturers know how addictive it is, so they put it in their food to entice you to buy more. And the effect that sugar has on our bodies interrupts our internal signalling from the gut to the brain, and this can impact our body's ability to know when we are full or hungry, for example. And if you aren't already aware, the whole fat-free craze started out from some really bad science in the 1950s and has swept the world, labelling fat as the single biggest contributor to weight gain. Except this is all based on lies. In actual fact, fat is an essential requirement for the body and we need it in order to stay balanced. By depriving ourselves of all of the good fats that are highly nutritious for us, we're actually creating a dangerous imbalance within our bodies, which is only further compounded by all of the additional sugar and sugar substitutes that we've replaced it with. And it's kind of like ordering a side of obesity with every meal that you eat. When it comes to cravings, our bodies are designed to induce them. Chemicals such as ghrelin are released to induce feelings of hunger, for example. But also when a woman is pregnant, the body will trigger cravings for food it intuitively knows contains certain trace nutrients, which are required to help grow the baby. That is how amazing your biochemistry is. However, cravings are also linked to addictions and the limiting behaviour that we can develop that creates these unhealthy patterns of behaviour in our lives. We often associate the term withdrawal symptoms with hard drugs and alcohol and the experience that users and abusers have to go through when they go cold turkey from them. Except we are all inadvertently experiencing daily withdrawal symptoms from the multitude of addictions that are commonplace and socially acceptable within our society. We just don't recognise it. A prime example of withdrawal symptoms is in the behaviour of young children. The subsequent high and then crash that shortly follows after eating candy or any type of food with additives or preservatives, for example, can often be labelled as a temper tantrum. This reaction creates highly erratic behaviour in these tiny humans, and we can mistakenly put this down to bad behaviour, which more often than not just isn't the case. It's just a bad diet. Now, this reaction is often a result of this tiny little person trying to cope with an insane amount of chemical reactions taking place all at once in their body. The resulting emotions that these trigger are often just too much for them to cope with. And the natural way for them to express all of this unwanted energy is to cry and release it through their tears or frustration. After they're done, they will either fall asleep to recharge themselves or they'll just become more subdued and then happy again once they're back to their natural way of being and they've regained balance. So from a biochemical perspective, what is at work with our addictions? Well, on a fundamental level, our addictions are driven by our desires, and desire itself is synonymous with a chemical called dopamine, which you may have heard of before. Any kind of pleasurable activity that we engage in will trigger this chemical release in your body. As well as being part of the heady cocktail of chemicals that's released into our bodies when we fall in love, dopamine is also a key component when it comes to motivation, and it's essential that we understand the way the production of this chemical in our brains has been hijacked by corporate companies in order to get us hooked on their products and services. So a great example of this is with social media. You get a notification to your phone, and this is your call to action to open whichever app sent you it. You feel an instant, often imperceptible rush of pleasure, especially if it's a message from someone you love. So you open the app, read the notification, and you then get a release of dopamine. Now, the next time your app pings, you check your phone, and the same cycle occurs. Now, this is called the cue routine reward cycle, and it has been adopted by thousands of different companies across the world, all vying for your attention and ultimately your money. This cycle creates addictive behaviour that is so subtle we rarely realise it until it's too late. And it's also the single biggest reason why all teenagers and many adults are permanently glued to their screens. So the problem we have at present is that we've structured our society in such a way that we are feeding the pleasure-seeking brain and delivering gratification for all of our desires in an instant. However, in our quest for pleasure, we are actually depriving ourselves of the opportunity to be truly successful in every area of our lives. To better understand why this is, let's refer back to a fascinating case study which began back in the 70s out of Stanford University. A group of young children under the age of 5 were placed in individual settings where researchers gave them 2 options. They could ring a bell at any time within the next 15 minutes and would be rewarded with a marshmallow. However, if they waited 15 minutes without ringing the bell, they would receive 2. The children involved in the case study had varying degrees of success, and you can actually watch some of the video recordings of their attempts to control themselves, which is really heartwarming. Now, the case study didn't just end in the room that day though, and the children involved were monitored over a period that spanned several decades. The findings from the research were astounding. Those that mastered the capability to control their desires and wait the 15 minutes to be rewarded with the 2 marshmallows were significantly more successful in all areas of life than the other peer group who gave in. Further research in this field now identifies that self-control is one of the key determining factors, along with intelligence, as to how successful an individual will be in life. However, there are other determining factors when it comes to how successful we can be, and we often see enablers as either a person or an individual. But our society is actually filled with organisations, corporations, cultural norms and collective habits which all enable us in some way to engage with what are essentially socially accepted addictive patterns of behaviour. Now, the way in which our society is currently structured is akin to a global petri dish that breeds consumers through the medium of limited education, social media, advertising on TV, billboards and websites, product placement on TV and movies, and not to mention PR that poses as journalistic research which tells us which products and services we should be buying. Now, this all feeds into the consumer cycle that is invested in us staying hooked on the products and services that we often don't need or want. Now, because of our lack of quality education within the mainstream, we can often leave school or college with a lot of pretty useless information. I mean, how many of us have actually used algebra in our everyday lives, let's be honest? The lack of basic understanding about the human body and our basic needs leaves us wide open to being manipulated and controlled by this consumer cycle. Now, if our basic needs aren't met each and every day, then we are left feeling unfulfilled and beholden to our desires in an endless loop of addictive behaviour patterns. When we get stuck in this pleasure trap of constant craving, it can lead to stagnation and that feeling of being stuck in life, often with no idea how you came to get to that point or how to escape the feeling or situation that you find yourself in. But it's not just the inanimate world of products and services that we can become addicted to. There is also the danger of becoming addicted to people in our lives. And unfortunately, codependent relationships are still very much a huge problem when it comes to addictions. As we've already touched upon in the session on conflict, toxic relationships can be found within families, friendships, or our romantic partners. We can become addicted to the people around us even though they can often display very questionable behaviour, enable us with other addictions and bring out the worst side of us. And whilst in the case of family and friends, it's often difficult to identify where the pleasure lies in the relationship, romantic partners are probably the most easy to identify within this category. So in our intimate relationships, because we take things to a whole different level when sex comes into the equation, this triggers a powerful cocktail of chemical reactions in our body. In women, sex bonds us to our partner and our body floods with oxytocin as our primal urge to procreate kicks in, and this is our body's response in preparing for motherhood and bonding to the father of our child. Except most sexual encounters are focused on the pleasure element and not actually about procreation. So this bonding ritual on the female's part can leave us feeling rejected, and once the man's testosterone levels have dissipated, their instinctual urge is usually to retreat. Plus, men are programmed on a very base level to spread their seed. So unless the guy you're with is already in love with you or highly developed in his emotions, he'll most likely be feeling the urge to move on to the next girl once you consummate the relationship. Now, we can't possibly talk about addiction and pleasure without bringing hedonism into the conversation. Whilst for many of you it may conjure up images of a sexual nature, hedonism is in essence the pursuit of pleasure for pleasure's sake. Pleasure is inherently fleeting. Therefore, no matter what kind of hedonistic activity you engage in, you will always revert back to your base level of emotion. Now, this can keep us locked in patterns of behaviour where we attempt to fulfil our deeper needs, but instead get stuck in the pleasure-pain cycle, which has been labelled the hedonic treadmill. Now, it's important to understand that our bodies hold on to memory on a cellular level, and this cellular memory is programmed by our patterns of behaviour. Over time, these patterns create what essentially becomes our emotional set point, which is the emotion we revert back to when we aren't engaging with an external stimulus. Now, if you've had a challenging past or experienced trauma during childhood, the likelihood will be that your emotional set point will sit at either fear, guilt, or shame. All of these emotions sit further down the scale of emotion than desire, which is where pleasure sits. And as we are constantly striving to feel better, this is why we reach for the things that give us pleasure, so that we can move out of that place of feeling bad. Except that as pleasure goes as quickly as it arrives, we revert back to our base level of emotion and are left wanting more, so we get stuck in the pleasure trap. So lots of food for thought there. In the next session, I'll be helping you to shift your perspective about some of the base limitations that may be holding you back from breaking out of any addictive behaviour patterns that are keeping you stuck. But for now, I want you to take out your journal and start to identify any addictive behaviour patterns that may be currently holding you back in some way. So I want to start by asking you, what are you yourself addicted to? And remember, it's not just the physical addictions that we think of, such as food, alcohol and drugs. We can also have emotional addictions to people and get stuck in toxic relationships. So ask yourself, are there any people in your life that are currently draining you or that you have a very erratic relationship with? Now, it may be that you have an addiction to technology, such as TV or social media, for example. I want you to think about all of these different areas of your life that you potentially have addictions in and ask yourself, how are these addictions or patterns of negative and limiting behaviour holding you back from getting what you really want in life? Often our addictions deplete our energy and we can end up being highly unproductive, and this can have a huge impact on other areas of our lives. We need to remember that time is such an important resource that we never ever get back, so it's essential that we identify all the ways in which we may be wasting it right now. Now, becoming conscious of these patterns is the first step to overcoming them, so try to go really deep here and recognise all the ways that you may be blocking yourself from focusing on what truly matters. And also ask yourself, what else could you achieve if you were focusing this time and attention on other, much more productive pursuits in life? And as always, sharing with the group can be a really powerful way to help you to realise how similar we can all be in our patterns of addictive behaviour. The group can also be a huge support if you're struggling to come to terms with any areas that come up for you. And as always, please feel free to direct message me on Instagram or Facebook if you need to chat.